welcome everyone. Welcome to Alliant International University, and welcome to our Unpacking Domestic Extremism webinar series. I am Dr. Mohammed Ahmed, and I serve as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Alliant International University. Alliant International University's mission is to prepare students for professional careers of services and leadership and promote the discovery and application of knowledge to improve the lives of people in diverse cultures and communities around the world. In the past few weeks, we have been horrified to learn about the racially motivated hate crimes involving physical violence and harassment targeting our Asian Pacific Islander communities. These are not isolated events. Since the start of COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a significant increase in inflammatory and xenophobic rhetoric, harassment, and targeted violence against our AAPI communities. And last week, we've seen the tragic killing of 8 people in Atlanta, 6 of whom were from Asian descent. These horrendous acts of violence damage our society and counter the values of our institution. Today's webinar will focus on combating hate and targeted violence against our AAPI communities. This webinar will consist of 2 sessions, a training on hate crimes from the San Diego Anti-Hate Crimes Coalition, followed by a community conversation panel discussion. Our theme of our webinar today is creating awareness and building community resiliency. Lastly, our program today is not political or will dive into politics both locally and nationally. Our main objective today is to educate our members of our campus community and the larger community about the dangers of hate crimes and its impact on our Asian American communities across the country, and engage in a healthy discussion and dialogue about how we can build resiliency in our communities. Lastly, we are also witnessing the shooting that took place yesterday in Boulder, Colorado, which cost the lives of 10 members in the community, including a police officer. Our Alliant family sends its sincere condolences and sympathies to the families of the victim. Our webinar today is also in partnership with ABC 10 News San Diego and will be moderated by anchor Melissa Macia from ABC 10 News San Diego. And Melissa, the stage is yours.
Mohammed, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who is joining us tonight for this really important conversation. Again, my name is Melissa Masiha. I'm a reporter and anchor with ABC 10 News. I want to thank our panelists for joining us too. We are going to introduce them here in just a moment. Just a few ground rules really quickly before we dive right into the program. Just regarding any news media who is joining us, you are all welcome to cover the program. And we just want our audience just to be mindful of others, respectful, courteous, all the things that we know to do. Of course, please keep your mics muted at all times and turn your videos off. As much as I'd love to see everyone's lovely faces, I would suggest for those listening to use the speaker view. So that's the best way to take all of the information in. And then for the panelists, when it's your time, of course, please turn your video on so that we can see, talk, and hear you. Like Mohammed said, our program is aimed to educate, to engage, because we won't know what the problem is unless we start to talk about it. And after we start to talk about it, of course, then we can work toward solutions. There will be a Q&A session in the second part of the program tonight. If you have any questions, you can send it to me in the chat. We're going to try to get to as many topics as possible in the short amount of time that we have. Our first session tonight, it's going to be a hate crimes training from the San Diego Anti-Hate Crimes Coalition, an amazing organization. The training will serve to educate, raise awareness among our community members about hate crimes by, first of all, providing key definitions. We need to know what exactly is a hate crime versus a hate incident. We want to outline detection and prevention efforts, and also to provide resources for victims and witnesses of hate crimes and bias incidents. So with no further delay, I want to bring in Christopher Tenorio. He is the Assistant United States Attorney with the Civil Rights Coordinator with the Southern District U.S. Attorney's Office. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks, Christopher.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone will see this. As we acknowledge the names of the people who died March 16th at the 3 spas in Atlanta, we hear people ask, was it a hate crime? And there is a legal definition, and we'll get to that shortly, but there are many other factors that we need to consider. For example, is there a common objectification of certain people that allows one to either justify violence, excuse it, or undervalue its effect on a community? We must also ask to whom empathy extends, whether that's to hardworking immigrants integrating into American life, to women trying to support themselves in a tough economy, or only to angry men who are just having a bad day. Some answers require ongoing dialogue and nuance, which we'll get to. But to help direct that dialogue, what I want to do is provide a legal framework and underscore the importance of community outreach and increased reporting. So first, let's get to what is a hate crime. A hate crime is a criminal offense against a person, group, or property motivated by bias. And that could be towards that person's race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. What's important to note, though, about these is it's unlike other crimes in that there's an objective element, namely the perpetrator's prejudicial motive. And there's also a subjective element, the terror that is imposed upon the individual victim or that individual's community. As we've seen, any crime that is aimed towards a specific member of a racial community, for example, is felt by everyone else in that community. And that's why these crimes are so important, because of the reach that extends to everyone else. By contrast, we look at what a hate incident is, and you're going to hear this discussion back and forth, so it's good to understand what we're talking about. A hate incident is an act of prejudice that's not a crime, that doesn't involve violence, threats, or property damage. So these are the kind of things that can include verbal slurs, online harassment, deliberate shunning of people in public or work or where you live, or workplace discrimination. So you may have heard a lot about data recently about how many hate crimes are going on, how that's rising or falling, but I think it's important for us to look at trends. We know from various sources that, generally speaking, hate crimes motivated by race, at least, have been trending downward through 2016. Now, data showed a pronounced increase in these crimes as political rhetoric targeted immigrants after 2016. And what we saw from behavioral science research is that racist rhetoric increases subconscious beliefs, including the idea that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners. So what the data shows is that attacks on Asians were highest in the early days of the pandemic, and there have been upticks corresponding to pushback, every time there's a little pushback on the prevention requirements that are imposed because of the pandemic. Now, while hate crimes have decreased between 2019 and 2020, the hate crimes directed at the AAPI community has increased approximately 150% from that same period. We've looked at a variety of large cities, and one in particular, it kind of gives us a snapshot from New York City. This was just from part of the year in 2020. What we've seen, those of us that have been looking at this data for many years, is that anti-Jewish hate crimes is always the highest number, and that's followed by anti-Black hate crimes. what we've seen, and there's a little example of anti-Asian hate crimes over the last three and a half years. And they were, as I said, trending downward through 2019. And then again, then in 2020, you see a really dramatic upsurge. One of the main things that we look to, however, is underreporting. Despite the increase in reports, we know that we still don't see the whole picture. Comparisons of data sources indicate that there's about at least 50% underreported. And for hate incidents, there's much greater disparity because most of those are not reported at all. So why is this? We've looked behind the numbers, and what we've seen is that a lot of victims either doubt law enforcement's ability to respond, they're hesitant to reveal their personal vulnerabilities or that of their community. There are often cultural and linguistic barriers to reporting, and we'll probably touch upon that later in our discussion. And there's often fear of reprisal. You report it and you might get backlash from your perpetrator. So how do we respond? One of the ways that we've been trying to get more people to report has been through efforts sponsored by the San Diego Regional Anti-Hate Crime Coalition. So the coalition brings together non-governmental organizations, community-based groups, and federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. Now, although it includes law enforcement and we respond to crimes, we all work together in order to prevent those crimes from occurring in the first place. We do that through community outreach and training, similar to what we're doing today. And when it does occur, when the hate crimes do occur, we look for ways to encourage that reporting. We do that so that we in law enforcement can respond and investigate. And we want to make available the victim resources that are there from the law enforcement agencies. And finally, we want to document evidence of bias and prejudice because we can use that as evidence of motive for hate crimes if and when they do occur. Now, some of the things that you might have seen, we posted a public service announcement in the Union Tribune last year from the Hate Crimes Coalition that had a list of a lot of community leaders stating what we reject and what we support and in favor of goals to prevent hate in the San Diego area. And we've done a variety of community forums through the last handful of years, again, trying to reach out to the community to teach them what hate crimes are, what hate incidents are, and what the value is in reporting those crimes. Now, we've seen shortly after inauguration, President Biden emphasized a federal commitment to improving responses to AAPI hate crimes and incidents. The directives included a review of existing anti-hate crime initiatives within the Department of Justice, including improving data collection. Now, what was good, one of the good things that came from this is that the important components of that order have been incorporated into a proposed new hate crime act called the COVID-19 Hate Crime Act. What is being proposed in this new act is an increase in Department of Justice oversight of coronavirus-related hate crimes, to have a dedicated official within the Department of Justice to receive that information and make sure resources are afforded to those issues. We're going to provide support for state and local law enforcement agencies via funds and training. And there will be a organization of the Health and Human Services. There's a COVID-19 Health Equity Task Force and a variety of community-based organizations that will get together to kind of find best practices on how to mitigate the rhetoric that's out there that lead to hate crimes and hate incidents. Now, and finally, one of the goals of the act is to make hate crime information more accessible to Asian American communities. And we'll do that by translating a lot of our resources, our website and complaint portals into at least the four major languages in the AAPI community, at least for starters. So you'll hear briefly about hate crime prosecutions by the District Attorney's Office. And they're the first line of defense in this area because we have robust statutes here in California. Federal hate crimes, on the other hand, have been intended to fill in gaps in localities where there either unwilling or unable to adequately address these crimes. I think it's instructive to understand how even with eagerness and a strong desire to pursue these cases, standards are often difficult to meet. We're working with a patchwork of laws through compromises. The laws that were passed were the results of compromises mandated by the eras in which they were passed. One standard was from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it came about in response to the challenges of the civil rights era, but it also underscores the challenges. One of the things that we can use this for is to prosecute force or threats of force. And this will be important in a minute to see how it compares to other statutes. It addresses crimes committed because of race, religion, color, or national origin. Again, remember, this is the law that was passed in '64, and you can note what it's missing. It doesn't address crimes based on sexual orientation, gender, or disability. And we also have an additional thing that we have to prove, another motive that the perpetrator was acting because of their desire to interfere with certain rights. And those rights are delineated in the statute. They include access to school, parks, jury service, hotel or other public accommodations, employment, and travel. And then we do have a couple other statutes that address discrimination in places of worship and housing discrimination. Now, you may have heard that we had the Matthew Shepard, James Byrne Hate Crime Prevention Act passed in 2009. Now, it gave us another tool, but it's still not perfect, because what it does, where it does cover acts of violence, unlike the 1964 Act, it does not cover those threats. So if there was no violence that occurred, this statute's unavailable. There are 3 separate provisions. One of those is racial hate crimes, and racial is in quotes because it's in its expansive view based on what you pretty much assume to be considered different races. But there's also now a connection for non-racial hate crimes, which would include gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability. But those things have to be tied to interstate commerce. In other words, it has to be some way affecting commerce in order to get federal jurisdiction. And we can also address hate crimes that occur on federal property. As I mentioned, what it provides is a patchwork for us to address certain crimes. Sometimes they'll fall under one statute and they won't under another. And fortunately, as I said, here in San Diego, we have the DA's office that covers the vast majority of hate crimes that do occur. One of the unique features of federal law, however, is our ability to respond to the way we increasingly communicate, which is email and social media. This is because threatening communications are easily anonymous and they fly across different jurisdictions with a simple keystroke. And it's something that we can prosecute in federal court. In order to do so, we have to prove that the perpetrator transmitted a threat to injure someone, and knowing that it would be received by that person as a threat and interpreted as a threat. There's another statute, cyberstalking, that can be implicated if it's a course of conduct and that conduct adds to substantial emotional distress. It's very important to note that these crimes are not protected by the First Amendment. So they have to be clearly defined, however, in order to be not protected as true threats. So what's protected by what's covered by these true threats? Just as the law has difficulty classifying every racially motivated offense as a hate crime, we're also restricted to a variety of distinctions outlined in case law to determine when hate speech crosses the line. For it to cross the line, it has to be a serious expression of intent to commit unlawful violence to a particular individual or a group. And there has to be some kind of indication of impending danger or harm to the victim. So then there are, as I said, free speech protections. So what's considered a threat? We get language, we have to evaluate it from a legal perspective to whether it violates the law. Political hyperbole is not a threat. Predictive speech is not a threat. And conditional statements are not considered a threat. Finally, exhortations, which is like strongly encouraging someone to do something. So let's review some examples. It'll kind of give us an idea of where someone might cross that line and sometimes where it's more difficult to prosecute these crimes. These are things that maybe we hear some kind of variety on the streets, in email, on social media. For example, all Asians should die for the virus. Anyone who can should shoot to kill them. Obviously, very offensive language and what we call hate speech, but is it a hate crime? Looking at kind of those outline of what's considered a crime and in the case law that applies, we see that this would probably not qualify as a crime, unfortunately. It says it's kind of, it's the example of political hyperbole. Anyone who can should kill them. It's someone speaking, and it's something you'll probably see on comment boards a lot, but it's not directed at anyone particular or showing something that's impending or imminent. How about this one? I foresee a noose in your future. This one kind of comes closer to the line. There's a case law where someone says, I predict that someone is going to put a bullet through the president's head. And the case law says, you know, that's a prediction. And so it's not really a threat. This one we might take a closer look at and see if there's any other context that we can add to it, because it's someone saying your future. And even though it's a bit of a prediction, we have to consider that a little bit more closely. Maybe there's something more that's indicating that the danger is more imminent. How about if I catch the virus, I'm putting an Asian in my rifle sights. Again, very ugly language, something that we've heard perhaps different variations of recently. There have been cases, there was one example in particular during the Vietnam War, someone had sent in a letter, if I get drafted, I'm going to put LBJ in my sights. That was not considered a true threat because it was conditional. Now, this would probably be considered the same because although it's affecting the community at large, it's not directed at one individual in particular. And again, it's a bit conditional. But again, we'll still look at it. A little similar to that would be, if you give me the virus, I'm going to slit your throat. Again, it's conditional. It may not be clear whether someone gives another person the virus, but it's directed to someone in particular saying, I'm going to slit your throat. It's conditional. It's a little bit more particular. It's a little closer to the line, and certainly something we would consider in the context of anything else that might have been said. Another one that's a common one we see in the law, someone should shoot you and I'd like to do it. It's a little bit of conditional, predictive, but it's similar to something that was said to President Obama. It said someone should kill that person and using an expletive, and I'd like to be the person to do it. You know, depending on how close the relation is from the perpetrator to the person and how dangerous imminent that danger might be, that's something that we'd like to consider, but it's pretty close to language that was rejected by the Supreme Court as not being a true threat. Now, we can see as language slowly gets closer to actual action and might be something that is prosecutable. For example, say someone sends to an Asian American a vial that's labeled revenge kung flu, like indicating that what's in the vial is some infection or some of the flu. This was a danger, especially during the early stages of the pandemic, because we thought that it could be transmitted more by touch and sent in the air and captured. There was a really interesting case involving someone sending powder that was benign but labeled as anthrax to a congressperson, and that was considered a true threat. So something like this would probably cross the line. Also, someone sends a poster to someone with their picture on it saying "wanted for murder." It's nothing conditional. It's not predictive, but something like this might also cross the line. There was a case involving President Clinton with his face on it and "wanted for murder" below it from anti-abortion activists, and that was considered a crime and prosecutable. So what does this all mean? What's the takeaway from these different varieties of hate crimes and the possibilities whether or not it might cross the line? What I'd like for you all to take away is that it's often difficult to know the difference between a hate crime and a hate incident. And so the answer should be report all of it, even if you don't know the source. If we cannot prosecute the crime as it's reported or the incident as it's reported, what we still can do is open up resources for victims. There's a Marsy's Law in the state of California that opens up a lot of resources for victims, but they don't become victims unless they're reported. And if a report goes to the DA's office or the police or the sheriff's department, we can still investigate that with the FBI and on the federal side, and those resources will still kick in. They'll include sometimes location services if there's imminent danger to a victim and need to be moved to temporary quarters. It will also it'll open you up for restraining orders to be filed on your behalf against perpetrators. And more than anything, it'll bring vigilance of law enforcement to that issue. Again, if it's just verbal slurs or other dangerous hate speech that doesn't rise to a crime, it's bringing that to the attention of law enforcement, who can monitor the area where you live, where it occurred, and perhaps the people that are doing it, or at least identify who might be sending these messages. If they're sent anonymously through email or social media, we can do that through sometimes through grand jury investigations to identify where those threats are coming from. It'll also continue to shine a light on these pervasive issues, which will slowly result in more empathy, less racist rhetoric, and eventually fewer crimes. I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, and we're going to have a panel shortly with an opportunity for you to ask these questions and hopefully kind of expand upon your knowledge of what a hate crime is, what we can do to help victims, and what resources are available. I want to thank you for your time and attention. I want to wish you all peace, health, and safety, and a wonderful good evening. Thank you.
And Christopher, thank you again with the Southern District U.S. Attorney's Office. Before you go anywhere, for folks who do want to find out more about the San Diego Anti-Hate Crimes Coalition, can you explain just how you would find more information about the organization?
Yes, we had you can contact us at SD, as in San Diego, sdnohate at gmail.com. We have information about our bi-monthly meetings and a lot of our community forums. In fact, on April 8th, we have another forum that's going to be in Spanish that's going to be co-sponsored by the Mexican consulate. And we'll be participating to try to reach out to the Latino community and share some of these same resources. But if you contact us and want to be part of that, we'll put you on the mailing list.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time and also a lot of clarity, because we get that question as well, hate crime versus hate incident. And we'll go a little bit more into that later on the program. So Christopher, again, thank you so much for the presentation and clarifying all of that. Before we get into the quick introductions here, I do just want to make one quick announcement here, is that Alliant, the School of Professional Psychology, they've also organized a forum for members of the AAPI community in order to create a safe space to allow the community to provide support as we begin to process just really everything that has happened, not just within the past week, but over the past year, over the past months. So this forum will be facilitated by Doctors Yashu Liang and Yuni Zheng, and they've been scheduled for Wednesday, March 24th. Oh, that would be tomorrow, March 24th. So if you want more information on that, reach out to Alliant University's Office of DEI. So we're going to get into the second part of the program here, the Q&A, where we're going to have just an open discussion. I want to take a minute to introduce each of the panelists. So when I call your name, go ahead and turn your video on, and we'll do a quick introduction. Again, the panelists, they're going to discuss how the pandemic has played a role in discrimination and targeted violence against our Asian community, and each person is going to bring their own perspective. The panelists will also share thoughts on healing, community engagement, and then strategies in prevention and intervention. So I'm going to give each panelist 1 minute to introduce themselves. First, let's go ahead and bring in Andy Vaughn, who is the president and CEO of Alliant International University.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us on this very important topic. I'd like to begin with a very strong statement about the recent uprising of anti-Asian American hate crimes we've seen really all across the US. And we've certainly seen our share in California and even in the San Diego area. And specifically, since early last year when the pandemic first hit, we're seeing it in the news time and time again. We were shocked by a stat that came out last week that anti-Asian hate crimes in the US have increased by almost 150% just since last March. And by the way, that's from the Center of the Study of Hate and Extremism in the US. And at Alliant, we express our unequivocal support for our Asian and Asian American communities. We stand by you. We reject racism, xenophobia, and stand with those who've been harmed by all forms of misguided actions, statements, and crimes. And as we just heard, not everything is a crime, unfortunately. And there are also actions and words that cause a lot of hurt across our entire country, and sometimes in our very own community. And this must stop. And we're very much in support of tonight's activity as a very beginning. And we don't see this as an end. This is a start. We are here to support you. We call on all members of our community to resist ill-informed and biased perspectives, speech, and actions. We look forward to starting, not continuing, but starting our discussion tonight and taking action with all of your help. So thank you again and welcome.
Andy, thank you so much. I want to bring in our next panelist, my friend Camille Chow, who's the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Manager at Boston Scientific and also a former anchor with ESPN.
Hey, Melissa, good to see you. Appreciate everyone having me on this call. I apologize actually for the lighting here, a little last minute switcheroo. So yeah, I've been a longtime journalist, and I currently am a diversity, equity, and inclusion manager because I felt like that was the type of space that I wanted to direct my career into because of the injustices that we're seeing around the country. And I look forward to diving further into what's happening to the Asian American community, some of the root causes of that, how media can play a role, and how each and every one of us can try to be a better ally in that regard. So I look forward to chatting further and having this discussion. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Carrie. We'll talk to you in a moment. Joanne Fields, who is the director of the Filipino Resource Center.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Joanne Fields, director of the Filipino Resource Center, and we evolved from the Asia Pacific Islander initiative, where I am also the Government and Public Relations Director. Because of COVID-19, it has magnified what we don't have in the community. We don't have a go-to in the Filipino community. And if you didn't know, according to the US Census, nearly half of the Asian Pacific Islanders residing in the county is of Filipino descent. So while we're speaking on to stop AAPI hate, we want to also make sure that resources and programs, so it's all intertwined, and I look forward to our discussion so I can explain in detail how it all is related.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and thanks for all your help lately, of course, doing interviews with our station as well. I want to bring in Frank Xu, a board member with the Asian Americans for Equality. Frank.
Thank you, Melissa. Hi, everyone. Frank Xu here. I'm the co-founder and the current board member of San Diego Asian Americans for Equality. So we have been serving this community for more than 7 years, and obviously recent incidents are of our great concern. And our mission is to encourage more Asian Americans to engage in public and civic affairs. And we are an organization to advocate for equal opportunity and equal treatment. And right now we have partnered with Solutions for Change to combat homeless issues for 3 years. And we have also hosted youth legislative essay contests in past several years to encourage more youth to think bigger. And nice to talk with you all, and look forward to discussing this important task with you.
Frank, thanks so much. We'll talk to you again in a moment. Leonard Trin, who is a deputy district attorney and also the lead hate crimes prosecutor for the San Diego District Attorney's Office.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks to Alliant for hosting this important event. I'm the lead hate crimes prosecutor for the San Diego DA's office. I've been a prosecutor for about 16 years. And the reason why hate crimes matter so much to me, my family, when I was a child, was a victim of a hate crime, an anti-Asian hate crime. And so it's an issue that's extremely important to me and one that I'm extremely passionate about. And I'm looking forward to having this discussion about what we can do to combat hate.
Thanks so much, Leonard. I don't know if it was just my audio, but I think you were fading out just a little bit, but we'll check back in with you again because we have the first question to you. And our last panelist here is Ms. Farhad Paul, the Immigrant Affairs Manager for the City of San Diego.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you for having me. Good evening. My name is Farhad Paul. I am the Immigrant Affairs Manager for the City of San Diego. My main task in this role is ensuring that the city is doing everything it can to guarantee immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers in San Diego have the opportunities they deserve to live lives of dignity and prosperity. That includes our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities and ensuring their safety and well-being during a period when these incidents have increased tremendously. I'm sure you all know this, but California has the largest Asian American population in the continental United States at nearly 15%, and 4 of the top 5 nations of origin among foreign-born residents in San Diego are Asian countries. I get very concerned when I see statistics like nearly 44% of all incidents reported to the Stop AAPI hate tool coming from California. And when I see that, I know that we must do better. So that is something that we are definitely tracking, and we'll continue to do so. My hope, my very sincere hope, is that we won't have to for much longer, but I think it's going to take all of us to get there.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate all of your introductions here. We're going to go ahead and dive right into the Q&A portion of it. Again, the panelists, please turn your cameras on so we can all see you. I do want to talk to Leonard Trent first, and all the panelists, yeah, feel free to turn your cameras on since we'll be talking with all of you. So Leonard, let's talk just about hate crimes. As from what you know, are hate crimes underreported here in San Diego, particularly in the Asian American community? And I have to be honest with you, I have talked to people and have gotten reaction online, and I see many people questioning if in fact there is a rise in hate incidents and crimes against Asian Americans. What have you seen just in your experience with the DA's office?
Yeah, I mean, we know that hate crimes are one of the most underreported crimes that are out there. And there are a lot of reasons why that's the case. You know, if you think about immigrants who come from countries where they believe that their government's corrupt, their military's corrupt, their law enforcement's corrupt, when they get here and they're targeted because of their nationality or their immigration status, they don't want to report because they have the same feelings about government, law enforcement, military here. And so, so we do know that hate crimes do tend to be underreported. They're also underreported because victims fear retaliation. They don't want to be continued to be targeted for their race, their religion, sexual orientation, and they fear that coming out and reporting the crime draws attention to them. I can tell you that here locally, we did see an increase in hate crimes between 2017 and 2018. The number of hate crime cases prosecuted by our office nearly tripled during that time period, and it stayed the same pretty much in 2019. We saw a slight decrease in 2020 once the stay-at-home orders were issued by the governor. And that's in large part because if you're not going to work and you're not going out and running errands and going to restaurants, you're not exposing yourself to people who potentially could have a bias against you because of your race, ethnicity, nationality. Specifically with respect to anti-Asian hate crimes, we didn't have any hate crimes referred to our office in 2017, in 2018, or 2019. And it wasn't until the start of the pandemic, pretty much in 2020, that we all of a sudden had 3 anti-Asian hate crimes reported to us since the start of the pandemic. So those numbers pretty much bear out with what's been happening nationally. To go from 0 over several years to all of a sudden having 3, that's pretty much in line with what we're seeing across the state and across the nation.
Thanks, Leonard, for explaining that. I do want to go to Carrie next. And Carrie, let's talk about the media coverage just regarding anti-Asian hate incidents and crimes. You've been a part of the news industry for a long time. How would you rate what we've been seeing on air, on print lately?
I think that's a start and a finish type question, because if you were to ask me where the media was when it comes to coverage at the beginning of this problem, let's say at this onset of COVID-19, and when we started first hearing that the type of rhetoric about the China virus and the Kung flu, I would say media coverage was, to be honest with you, around like a D and an F, because people were talking about the microaggressions that were evolving, the power behind those words, because it's not just one of those situations where oftentimes when you come from a majority type background, when you hear these types of words, these comments like Kung flu, the initial reaction might be, it's so simple. And everybody on this panel has probably heard, it's just a joke. It's just a simple joke. But what the person saying that oftentimes does not realize is the person who's receiving that type of information has been receiving that type of microaggression perhaps their entire life. And it is a constant reminder that it is an otherization of this individual. And people in the Asian community have been speaking out, have been saying, hey, there is an issue here. And the coverage was not there. And where the coverage is now, I would say, to be honest with you, is much better. I'll give it even an A-, B+. But one of the reasons why this is happening, and I want to give a lot of credit to all the AAPI reporters out there who are on the ground trying to make this an issue that people talk about and understand and shed a spotlight on what's happening. But what's also happening simultaneously is, so I've been in newsrooms from large network, from the national network TV stations to the smallest local television station, to the smallest newspaper, weekly newspaper, to large national publications. And what I can say universally in all these places, when it comes to newsroom management, when it comes to who's determining the type of stories that are covered, there is a lack of diversity. And what that means equals a cultural blind spot. When people are talking about these types of issues, and it's not a malicious thought process, but it's merely a fact of, if this is not what is in my normal circle, and I do not know that this is happening, and I'm paying attention to what all the other TV stations are doing, and guess what? All the other TV stations look exactly like me. And so because of that, we continually have this cultural blind spot. And that's what's partially led to the lack of talking about this incident until, sadly, 8 people died in Atlanta, 6 of which were Asian American.
And Carrie, thanks for that insight there. I want to ask Joanne a question, because we've talked about this one recently. How has the pandemic and the rise of hate affected the elderly in our Asian American community here in San Diego? I know you work with them closely.
All right. So there are a number of things that we've noticed now. One, there's question about what is a hate crime, and I appreciate that there was that. What is the definition? What are the elements? And because we've had an elderly 83-year-old Filipina lady, Lola, that was riding on the trolley. She was on her way home after visiting friends on a Monday morning, taking the trolley from Encanto to downtown where she lives, and she was attacked. So their whole community, not just the seniors, but the kids, the neighbors, the family members are like, how can this happen? And it's random, but it's not random when we see and hear thousands of reports being collected by the National Stop API Hate organization in the Bay Area. When we hear reports from the district attorney's office seeing an uptick that our elderly are traumatized. And with that trauma, we need healing. And how will they receive healing if there's a lack of mental health services that is culturally sensitive, that is culturally competent in delivering that service? We also see that because this Lola's traumatized, that she's and doesn't have any other form of transportation. So there's other services that are needed. She needs groceries delivered to her. She needs rides to doctor's appointments. And we would think victim services will provide that, and she's been offered that, but she's not in that comfort zone. So we do have a forum, and I'll plug that with Leonard Trin and with our district attorney to find out how else can we better serve our API community, our elderly community, because when you see something, say something. That's another thing, we're not reporting. So all of these things that were already happening in the community has just been magnified because of what we're now seeing on the news. And I appreciate Carrie, I love that term, I'm gonna use that term now, the cultural blind spot. It has been occurring, but not until now that we have this national platform that 8 people have died. And I don't wanna say out of 8, there's 6, there's 8 people that died, period. And there's Asians that were involved in, and it's heartbreaking. But that reoccurring trauma is affecting our elders, it's affecting our whole community. And having other discussions with other groups, it's a trigger. It's now a trigger for other traumas that may have personally occurred. And now how are we supposed to deal with that? So when, as we go forward in this discussion, I like to just sit that there, that this is triggering other microaggressions, other events that is related to hate crime.
Joanne, thank you so much. And I know you mentioned there's another panel coming up, and like we've all talked about, we don't know the problem unless we get it out there in the open. Frank, I do want to talk to you about the next question. You know, what do you feel, being in the community, a leader for so long, is the root cause in these spikes of hate crimes? And we all know in the AAPI community, it's not new, but you know, in your opinion, what have you seen?
Yeah, first of all, you know, it's disgusting to see all these spikes in hate crimes, and it's very concerning. And second of all, I don't quite agree with lumping all these tragic incidents into one category, hate crimes. It is imprudent and oftentimes inaccurate. Doing so will deflect us from addressing the underlying issues and sometimes lead to counterproductive actions. So does racism play a role in these incidents? Yes, of course. But only talking about racism won't solve any of these issues. So with the tragic cases we talked about today, these incidents range from police brutality, petty crimes, pranks, to mass shootings. And I believe most of them can be attributed to rising crime rates and increasing criminality in the general society. Many incidents happened in urban settings like San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, New York, and of course, Atlanta. So let me read you some stats from the San Francisco Police Department 13 years ago, which was recently reprinted by San Francisco Gate on March 2nd, 2021. So in the 2008 survey by the police department, in which about 300 robberies were analyzed, 85% of them, the victims, were Asian Americans. So obviously the crimes against Asian Americans have been there for a long time. So things are getting worse because urban crimes are rampant and out of control in some cases. And under the current so-called criminal justice reform, many advocates worry more about the assailants than the victims, which in turn encourages more crimes to happen. As an example, San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin has already dropped a charge against one of these assailants. I'm also aware that the criminal justice reform has an ultimate goal to re-engineer the racial composition of the criminals, which should not be a goal for any justice system. And if the justice system cannot treat people equally, crime rates will surely rise even more, and so do hate crimes. Thank you, Melissa.
Frank, thank you. And thanks for bringing that information that you said, I mean, is more than 10 years old, and yet, here we are talking about it right now. Farhad, you are the new Immigrant Affairs Manager for San Diego. When it comes to hate incidents, hate crimes in the Asian American community, have you personally heard of any in your new role? If so, what makes them particularly disturbing? Your reaction to all of that?
Sure. Well, so before I moved to San Diego late last fall, I actually spent about 4.5 years in Dallas, Texas, and had been tracking the increase in these incidents in the Texas, kind of North Texas area in that period of time. And one incident that really stuck out to me and struck me was an incident last March that happened in Midland, Texas, which is not too far from Dallas, in which 3 Asian American family members, including a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, were stabbed. And when they apprehended the suspect, he essentially said that he stabbed the family because he thought that the family was Chinese and they were infecting people with a coronavirus. And that just it struck me immensely. And I know that is one incident out of many, but the fact that this is happening, one, that it's happening, period, but 2, that it is so deep that someone is willing to stab a child as a result of that is just has, again, I know I keep using the same term, but it has stuck with me. And I think this is something that should be disturbing in so many ways to us all, because there's the subtle assumption, and Carrie mentioned it earlier, of who is quote unquote American and who is not, based on what someone looks like, what their perceived heritage is, any number of things. And we need to do a better job as a society of focusing on the true history of the United States. So it was 20,000 Chinese immigrants who built the transcontinental railroad. It was US-born children of Japanese immigrants that made significant contributions to the agriculture of the Western United States, including California. It was 250,000 Filipino Americans who are veterans of World War II. We could list major contributions of each and every group of Asian immigrants that has come to this country, and it still wouldn't be enough or do justice to what Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have done to make America what it is today. I think we can all say acts of hate have no place in our city, but we also have to recognize that hate doesn't materialize out of thin air. It starts with disrespect. It starts with discrimination, from seeing an entire group as the other, from dehumanizing and failing to appreciate and value human dignity. It also comes from a fundamental lack of empathy and compassion, and a failure to understand that we're more similar than we are different. And each and every single person deserves to feel safe and feel protected and valued, because each and every one of us wants to feel safe and protected and valued.
Thank you so much. And you brought up an interesting point just about education. Just personally, I remember in elementary school, a very tiny snippet about the Japanese internment. And I think it was maybe about this big. And the only reason why it stuck with me as I got older is because I had a classmate who was Japanese, and his grandmother came in to talk about it. Other than that, I probably would have only learned that very little tiny bit of our history. So thank you for bringing that up.
One of my best friends is fourth generation Japanese American, and I thank my lucky stars each and every day that I had the opportunity to meet her, because she educated me. And it shouldn't come down to these individual interactions. It should be part of our educational system.
Right.
And it needs to be robust.
Exactly. And speaking of education, Andy, talking about higher education, Andy, how does hate and bigotry impact higher education? And we did have a question come in regarding higher education. If I can find that really quick. You know what, Andy, if you can answer that first part of the question. Oh, here it is. And what's the role of academia in educating the community to reduce and eliminate hate crimes? So Andy, if you can kind of pile that all in together.
Sure, thank you. Let's start with the second question first, because you were just talking about one of the answers a moment ago. Did you know I went to public school in the Midwest, good school system, the 1970s, early 1980s. And in the American history books, the internment camps for the Japanese wasn't even in there. Can you believe that, everyone? I mean, it wasn't until even outside of my university undergrad experience where I actually learned about that. And so to answer your question, the role of higher education is to make sure that we tell the truth. Our history is not all great. And while that's not okay, it's not okay not to talk about it. And I think one of the roles that higher education plays is to be honest, be transparent about even our black eyes and our warts from the past. But more importantly, how do we move forward and fix those? How do we educate those? How do we get the ignorant to understand that things are changing, and they're changing rapidly, not changing fast enough, but changing rapidly. And so the role of higher education, Alliant is almost 100% graduate level. So our students are more in that, over 30 range. And so we also, though, focus many of our programs, the bulk of our student population is in clinical psychology, marriage, family therapy, and other clinical counseling programs from our California School of Professional Psychology. Our second largest programs are training K-12 teachers in California for teaching credentials. Special ed's a very large program we have too. And I will tell you, the role of higher ed in everything we do in mental health and teacher ed really is centered around a curriculum that enriches cultural competence and cultural understandings, because these are the kind of professionals we want in our world, to have empathy, to understand our differences, celebrate our differences. And when I look at our university, and many universities are similar, is that, for decades, for over 100 years, Alliant University has celebrated our differences, not try to put wedges in between us because of it. And I think that's really the role of higher ed, is to help with that. The other role of higher ed is to bring communities together. We have a unique opportunity as higher education institutions to provide the forums like tonight, or even in a post-COVID world, to bring people together in person on our campuses, to host forums, to educate, to train and move forward. And it really, higher education is all about critical thinking skills, bringing people to the next level, thinking at a macro level how every decision we make impacts 10, 20-fold out. And I think part of our role is, right now it's virtual, but when we get back together in a short term here, is to bring people together in our campus communities and make sure that we're a part of that solution. So I think the first question you asked had to do with hate and bigotry and the impact on higher education institutions. And we've certainly been asked that question before, and I usually turn that question around and how higher ed can impact hate and bigotry. But let me first of all answer the question as stated. Much like the general population, it impacts and disrupts our learning process. But how it's different in higher ed versus maybe the general population is we take hate and bigotry that happens, whether it's inside or outside of our classrooms or campuses, and we really develop discussions around that. And obviously, there's human beings involved. There's going to be emotional opinions, and tempers do flare sometimes when that happens inside the classroom or at a forum. But I think for a higher ed institution, we then impact hate and bigotry by working through it in a very educated way, in a process to actually heal and grow from it. And hopefully those that are on the wrong side of history, and there are many, some of them do change over time. And that really is the goal of education and training, isn't it? Is to, not everyone is going to change, and we can't force them to, But I think part of our role in hate and bigotry is to do the best we can about using facts and research, and that is who we are, using facts and research as educators to help express that change.
Andy, thank you so much. I want to hop back to Carrie here. What can people in the media or on social media do to take a stand against hate crimes targeting Asian American communities? And should those in the news media take a stand? Should they be doing that, considering everyone's trying to, of course, be able to tell both sides of a story?
Yeah, I'll answer the second part of that question first, which I think is really interesting from a media perspective, because it ultimately, when I was at ESPN as one of the only Asian American anchors out there, there were a lot of Asian American issues that popped up, and I started to debate, hey, is this worth falling on the sword for? And to me, and everyone has to ask themselves this question, to be honest with you, for me, when it came to racism and things like that, I would defend that and I would fight it. And if anyone came to me from a corporate standpoint that said, hey, you are now injecting your opinion into this matter, and I would merely say, like, if we're talking about racism, it's a fact. It is. I don't have any problems denouncing racism. If we go into a politics world, that's a different story. But I think what's been happening in these last few years, in the last 5 years or so, is this melding of politics and racism, where we've always known racism is bad, but now all of a sudden that's been misconstrued. So in that regard, I personally say that I encourage seeing what I'm seeing from a lot of reporters talking about, hey, this is what I view from my perspective. Seeing these perspectives, because oftentimes, to feed off of what Andy is saying about education and what everyone is saying, you need to understand different perspectives, because if you only are looking at life or news events through the same echo chambers where you're getting all and consuming all your information, you're going to continue to get that same type of information. And then you will no longer be able to really discern what is true and what is false. And I think it's really important to interject your opinions when it comes to racial matters like that. As opposed to the first question you asked about what can media and social media do to take a stand against hate crimes. One thing that I want to echo what Frank had said, and what I think everyone here is kind of echoing, is there is a massive difference between hate crimes and hate incidents. And we cannot make these false equivalencies, because ultimately that hurts the entire cause. Because, and I will even say, like, some of the things that I'm saying with Stop AAPI Hate, if we're talking about when you insult someone or when you use a racial slur, it is terrible. And the next time I'm told that, I will lose my composure. I will be honest with you. But that is not necessarily a hate crime. And so when we are reporting stories about X amount of hate crimes, or this drastic percentage of a rise in crime, we cannot make these false equivalencies, because ultimately when we're looking at other communities, if we're looking at the Black community, brown communities, and so forth, and they're dealing with these types of situations, we cannot make false equivalencies. And it's very important that media make that distinction when they are deciding, hey, this is a hate incident or this is a hate crime. And ultimately, I think what reporters are doing is retweeting the stories or reposting stories that they're hearing from across the country when it comes to these types of issues, because as Farhad said, that I remember distinctly of hearing of that incident in Texas, when you had the person assault the kids because of this fear. And we need to perpetuate that to make sure that that it resonates with everyone. And the only way to resonate that is by continually reposting or just sharing these types of stories. And then the last thing that I want to mention about this, Melissa, is simply that this is not a zero-sum game. When it comes to media, oftentimes it's the flavor of the month. And to be honest with you, right now, Asian American crime or hate incidents is the flavor of the month. National media is covering this right now because it's trending. But when I say it's not a zero-sum game, that means we can talk about multiple systemic racial injustices at the same time. The things that are happening to the Black community are still happening. They still need to be talked about right now. But what's also happening to the Asian community should have also been talked about this entire time. And I think it's very, very important that media as a whole remember that consumers of news and information can handle the fact that there can be more than one racial injustice at the same time. But it seems as if systemically, whether for so many different reasons that we can get into, it's only enough time for one, and that's not the case.
You bring up a good point that I think is often not discussed enough. So thanks, Gary. I want to go back to Leonard. When we're talking about law enforcement, how can law enforcement work in partnership with the community to combat hate crimes? Especially, we talked about this earlier, there is a fear of minorities, people of color, to go to law enforcement. How do we bridge that?
Well, I think it first starts with building trust between law enforcement and the community. I think anyone who's here.
Oh no, I think you're fading. Your audio is fading.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, yes.
Okay. What I was saying was I think it first starts with building trust in the community between law enforcement and the people that they serve. I think we all recognize that trust in law enforcement is pretty low right now, and it's been low for a long time. When I talk to various communities throughout San Diego about why hate crimes aren't being reported, I get a lot of responses that are of the vein of, well, what's law enforcement going to do about it? They don't take these cases seriously. And so that only compounds the lack of trust problem when people in the community think they're not going to do anything about their hate crime, that they're debating whether or not to report. Every crime victim deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And so I know the two largest law enforcement agencies in San Diego, the Sheriff's Department and San Diego PD, they have liaisons throughout their department that work specifically with various communities. And I think, San Diego PD has a gay and lesbian liaison, they have a trans liaison, they have an API liaison. And I think there's some value to having someone that you can directly go to that is of your community. They can understand the fears and concerns that you have because you've been targeted for whatever the characteristic is that's protected under California's hate crimes laws. It's a go-to person so you can get updates on your case and the investigation, which I think is so crucial. I think following through on the cases is kind of the next thing that law enforcement can do. I mean, too often people, when they call 911 and the officers respond and they get the initial report, that's the last time they hear from anyone related to law enforcement. And that simply should not be the case. We created a hate crime hotline email address and a phone number so people can call us and get updates on their case. And every time that someone reports something to us on our hotline, we respond within 24 hours and give them a case update. And so those kinds of things that we can do to be a little bit more transparent about where the investigative process is, I think those are the things that law enforcement can do to work with communities to combat hate.
Thanks, Leonard. And as we get to the next question, someone was asking about a list of resources or links that we can share. How can we as community leaders bring support to our community who are experiencing traumatic triggers now? If there are any resources or links that you as community leaders know that can be helpful, feel free to add it in the chat too, or the hate crimes number, Leonard, for people to see that. I do want to go back to Carrie for a couple reasons. This will be his last question. And for those who don't know, Carrie lives on the East Coast. So I want to thank him for staying up late with us here in San Diego to discuss this. So Carrie, so you are now focused on diversity at Boston Scientific. You touched a little bit on this earlier, but I just reemphasize, and any last final thoughts from you. How do we make sure that there is fair coverage of the Asian American community in the news industry, not just the bad things, moving forward? Because what we're hearing about are quite honestly very, very sad. I mean, it's horrible, and we're hearing, like you said, flavor of the month. We're hearing a lot about it now. How do we make sure that coverage moving forward is fair and equal?
I think it's really pushing, again, I go back to these. The way that media is set up for those who are not familiar is essentially every morning there is an assignment meeting, and multiple parties go over what stories should be discussed over the course of the day. And in that regard, I think it's imperative that reporters continue to search and talk with the communities, these Asian American AAPI communities, work with local leaders like everyone who's on this call to find out what's happening in the community. And it doesn't always have to be something negative, obviously, but being able to continue, what's the word I'm looking for? To be able to continuously build those types of relationships so that when those stories come up, whatever they might be, the Asian Americans are seen. Because I think one of the biggest problems and what's escalating and what's led to this is this minimalization of the AAPI experience, because they're just not seen. And what I think is important, one small way to kind of battle that from a news coverage standpoint is when you have subject matter experts in different, you can get a medical doctor, you could get a lawyer, whatever, you know, you don't have to go to continuously the same spokespeople. And in fact, the Asian American Journalists Association, they have a program called Studio in which you can reach out to subject matter experts who can talk about these things. So then slowly but surely on your subconscious, when everyone is watching TV, you'll notice the Asian American talking about these issues and not always necessarily about those AAPI issues. It's one of those things where I will tell you this, when I was growing up, and I still kind of do this out of habit, when I'm watching TV, I'll be like, oh, there's an Asian. And I think a lot of people do that because it's so uncommon. But if we can start to slowly create that normalization, I think that's a huge step towards that. The other thing that I would like to say is from an individual standpoint, not just media, but we all have a voice. And I think oftentimes in the Asian American community, because of our a lot of cultural backgrounds and history, it can be very difficult for us to speak up. But what I love seeing here is Asian Americans speaking up about the cause, not just, again, for Asian issues. It needs to be across the board for all racial injustice and speaking up, because the more we speak up about those causes, the more then they will see us as well when it comes to our own causes. But if for those who are, and maybe this is because of the space that I'm in currently now, but whatever job you work, if you're on this call and you work at wherever you work, can you bring up diversity, equity, and inclusion questions? For instance, like, can you have a listening session? Can you talk about some of these issues with your bosses? Can you create, make people more understanding of these microaggressions? Provide the resources that exactly you're talking about, because even if internally a company cannot provide these types of resources, there are so many external resources to deal with what is happening in the community right now. And I would just urge everyone to be able to take advantage of that voice, your voice, however difficult it might be.
Hey, Carrie, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully you and the baby get some rest tonight. So we appreciate it. I do want to go to Frank here. You know, Frank, what does equity look like here in the Asian American community here in San Diego?
Well, yeah, based on the 2018 Pew Research report, indeed the income inequality in the United States is greatest among Asians, and so does San Diego. So just like any other racial group, there are very rich people and social economically disadvantaged people within the Asian American community. However, just like Carrie just said, you know, the film Crazy Rich Asians and the model minority myth may have created a public perception that Asians are mostly successful, which is definitely not true. And this racial stereotype is probably part of the reason why criminals have increasingly targeted Americans of Asian descent. Hence, I urge everyone not to examine everything through the lens of race. And I want to echo President Vaughn about the importance of the education. And I am all for the ethnic studies that can help different race groups of students understand each other better, you know, and build a bridge, like the lessons about Japanese internment, the Chinese Exclusion Act, etc. However, recently the tragic Atlanta shooting was used by the California State Board of Education to approve a radical ethnic studies model curriculum. That curriculum came from a perspective of critical ethnic studies. That curriculum pits different racial groups against each other in education by putting some groups as oppressor and some other race groups as oppressed. And that will further stoke racial animosity and exacerbating racial tensions. And that curriculum also promotes a victimhood narrative among Asian Americans. I'm very concerned that recent tragic incidents will be used for political pandering to stir up fear and hatred, and to advance a radical divisive agenda, which will lead our country into illiberal and undemocratic outcomes. And that connects me to the Cultural Revolution in China. Thank you, Melissa.
I appreciate your opinion, Frank. And Andy, you actually have the next question here just about the role of higher education institutions in combating hate. I don't know if you had any other reaction to what Frank said, just regarding the curriculum or just in general. And I do know someone did ask about specific to the university. If you can answer that first question about the role of higher education institutions in combating hate, or if you had anything to say regarding Frank's comments. And a student also asked, what are some initiatives that can be implemented on campus for students and faculty of the AAPI community? So a lot to pack in there.
Oh, no problem. So thank you, Frank, for the comments. And we totally agree that education also needs to get better, and that includes higher education. We need to challenge ourselves even more than ever with what's happening in we talk about the world, but we can focus right in our communities. There's so much to improve right in our very own communities. And that includes our own college communities. Before Kerry left, he said something, it was actually his first comment tonight, that was, hey, get over it. It's just a joke. I'm just trying to have fun with you. You're too sensitive. As kids, I think we heard that for all kinds of insensitivities. Oh, they just need to have thicker skin. I'm just joking around. And, that's got to stop. And I think it's the role of higher education to help with that. Obviously, K-12 is where it has to start and say that's not okay. But it goes beyond without really telling someone the why behind the what. It doesn't do a lot of good. It doesn't sink in. In other words, I think our knee-jerk reaction tends to be, hey, don't say that. That's not nice. And people go, okay. Most shrug it off. And it really needs to go much deeper than that. So where can higher education help? Again, I mentioned it earlier, but using research and methods and teaching our K-12 teachers, teaching parents, teaching community members how to really make this stop. Because if you just say, hey, that's not nice, don't say that, well over half of your perpetrators are going to go, okay, whatever. And they'll brush it off, and they'll kind of say, well, you're too sensitive too. It's just a joke, get over it. But I think for us to really get to the root cause here, the core issues, is really learning and teaching the methods and how we do this. And I think that's where our California School of Professional Psychology Alliance would like to go in the near future, is offering free to our community members. And community members can mean local communities, geographic speaking. It could also mean our partners that we work with. It could mean all of you and then some. But really diving into seminars and webinars until COVID is over that really address stopping this at its root and core, its nasty core. How do we really do that? And I think that's really where we come into play. To answer the student's question, more than ever, we're dedicating resources to our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And we're so fortunate to have Mohammed join us just about 6 months ago. And Mohammed came to us from San Diego State, who's leading our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion department now in our office. And we are really looking at DEI not as an initiative or one singular goal, but rather a lens that all of our initiatives, our strategic plan at the university, get filtered through. And so it's a very conscious choice of saying, it's not really this pillar over here in a silo. It is a lens that everything, every decision we make, every policy, from time to time we're challenged. And I welcome that. I like the challenges to say, hey, you know what, this policy that the university has may have been written through the lens without considering underrepresented populations. And it's being open to those challenges. So tell me more about that without getting defensive. I think that's our first knee jerk. We get defensive, right? And instead of getting defensive, saying, oh, get over it, whatever. It's more about, tell me more about that. And opening up those conversations, creating a space where people feel comfortable and safe, bringing up alternative ways to look at maybe the things way we're done and challenge those ways. And so we are open to that and we are on it. And I think we really encourage all organizations to do the same. So thank you for the questions.
And Andy, thanks for explaining that. And I just want to give a quick shout out to my station, ABC 10 News, where we have specific initiatives devoted to EDI. And, I can say as an Asian American, I do feel comfortable. I haven't always felt this way, but at this point, I do feel comfortable bringing up issues, talking about issues. So like Carrie said, like you said, wherever you guys work, for those tuning in, nothing can be done unless the issue is brought up to begin with. I do want to bring in Farhad here. In San Diego, what is the city doing to ensure San Diego is a welcoming city? Because there are at some points when stories come into us, they're not always portraying a welcoming city.
Right. No, that's a great question. I can provide a little bit of history and background here. So in late 2017, the city received a grant to work on an immigrant inclusion and integration plan. And that plan was put together with a lot of community input. There were multiple sort of community forums, large convenings. There was a steering committee that really did the work of doing essentially a year-long process of talking to other cities with immigrant affairs offices, looking at other plans that have been put together and looking at best practices about how we can do this better in San Diego. And so that year-long process kicked off in early 2018. And the plan was synthesized and put together by early 2019. It's a very comprehensive set of robust recommendations, and it's divided up into 5 major categories. It's called the Welcoming San Diego Strategic Plan. And it goes into recommendations covering education, access to economic opportunity, inclusive access, so things like language access, promoting civic engagement, and then ensuring safe and protected communities. And the overall goal of this plan is essentially ensuring that the immigrant and refugee and asylum-seeking community in San Diego can truly integrate into the city, into the community, and have what they need in order to be able to thrive and succeed here. A part of that effort also involved creating, for the first time, an immigrant affairs manager position within the city structure. Last year, it actually was contained within the mayor's office, and the previous immigrant affairs manager role as the first person in this position was to assess these recommendations and really evaluate what's feasible to implement within kind of short, medium, and long-term periods. Now, I will say that the plan was put together before COVID hit. And as we all know, COVID has had disproportionate impacts on immigrant and refugee communities in multiple ways, but it has also impacted the immediate needs of the community and how we can best support them. So all of that to say, we have a fantastic plan that we plan on using as a roadmap moving forward, but we also, to some extent, need to be flexible and adapt to changing circumstances and changing needs so that we can be as responsive as possible to the immigrant, refugee, and asylum-seeking communities. And I will say, again, it's great that we have this immigrant affairs manager position. I, have my work cut out for me, as you can imagine. but also, the goal really is to create an office of immigrant advancement within the city of San Diego, because only then can we ensure that this is sustainable in the long term. And I will also say it can't just be up to one person with a particular title or role or a particular office. It has to be on all of us, both within city staff and every single department, but also within the broader community. Immigrant inclusion work, I think, is everybody's role, whether formal or informal, because we are San Diego. We have such a large foreign-born population that contributes to our region in so many different ways, whether it's economically, whether it's civically, socially, culturally. There's so much benefit there, and we need to do our part to make sure that, again, they have what they need to succeed. And then the last thing I will add is there have also been multiple city commitments as a result of some of these incidents. So I don't know if you all remember, but last June, there was a San Diego City Council resolution that denounced xenophobia and anti-Asian racism and sort of affirmed the city of San Diego's commitment to the well-being and safety of the API community. There was a March 2021 resolution, so just earlier this month, condemning hate and extremism. And after the events last week, the city stood with the API coalition in condemning the attacks in Georgia. So that is something that the city continues to keep an eye on. We're also working on establishing an Office of Race and Equity. There's an ongoing search for the city's first chief equity officer. So again, this is all ongoing work moving forward. We're making progress. We have a lot more to do, but it is definitely front and center in our list of priorities.
Great, thank you so much for explaining that. Joanne, here in San Diego, how are Asian Americans partnering with others? Not just AAPI. Again, this is not just, within our community that we're trying to do things. How are Asian Americans partnering with other people of color, non-people of color, to bring awareness? And it's just a quick second part to the question. Someone had asked, our AAPI community isn't comfortable reaching out for resources, like some people have mentioned. Would it help if resources and groups did more in-person type outreach?
I would say yes for the in-person, especially with someone that looks like them. So as far as working with other groups, one example again, on Wednesday, April 7th, we will have a Stop API Hate Summit. It's a launch of a series with a number of decision makers, elected officials, and groups that offer resources. So with the DA, yes, we want to know what constitutes a hate crime, but victim services. We are working with the affinity law enforcement agencies. We're working with the Pan-Asian Police Officers Association, the Filipino American Law Enforcement Organization, to put a face to a name. So with the API initiative, we want to create what I'm calling like a concierge service, that when Lola Rosario was attacked, she didn't feel comfortable speaking to someone through a translator for mental health services. We brought a person, Agnes, who is a licensed social worker, to provide her counseling. And she was able to get her into a comfort zone to commit. And now she is receiving the needed service so she can get over the trauma and be able to live her life without fear. We need that. I also have reached out, where I had a meeting yesterday with Pedro Anaya, a member of the San Diego Human Relations Commission for the County of San Diego. We like to have a forum so that we can invite other San Diego County departments to have this discussion of how they can better outreach with us, and to work with Andrew who is the new director of equity. So these are the entities, some of the entities that we're working with. Mayor Todd Gloria has committed to working with us as well. I'll have a meeting with Michaela Valk of his staff to talk about how what that will look like. And again, we shouldn't be in just a silo of just APIs talking to APIs. We do need to work with other entities so that they know who we are. Like when I'm hearing Andy talk about higher education, well, who is our point of contact in higher education that's in leadership, that someone that looks like us, so that there is a comfort zone to have these hard discussions. I just left the meeting with San Diego Unified. Yes, they have a resolution to support APIs, but what does that mean? We want to make sure that it's not just a reso. There's a number of resolutions. I've worked, it's no secret, I've worked with 5 elected officials. I know how that works, but what is the substance of this action? What are we going to do with the resolution to make sure that we are really receiving equity? Because I feel like that's the flavor of 2021 thus far, is that equity, equity, equity. But what does that mean when the lack of services was happening even before the shooting? But now that we are the flavor of the month, with that now we need to make our not, I don't want to say demands, but to make sure that our needs are up front and center, that it's not just a discussion, but we take action. So there are a number of groups that have reached out, and I'm excited about that, because now we are at the table. And I do want to salute Channel 10 for that. You have amplified our voice. Other media news stations are now wanting to amplify our voice where we didn't have that before. And my hope is that we will not be reactionary to these series of events, but proactive and sharing with the community what resources are out there, who are our allies, and where do we need improvement. Everything isn't great right now, but we're moving in the right direction. Having this discussion with all of you is great. But I do want to make an awareness note that we say API, but APIs are not all represented on every panel or everywhere. Our Pacific Islander brothers and sisters, our Native Hawaiians brothers and sisters are not at the table, but yet we throw around API, but the PI isn't represented. And also our South Asian, and I bring that up again because that huge umbrella, I think we need the community to know what that huge umbrella entails, and that while we have commonalities, we do have differences also. And I think we need to just have that on the radar, so that while we work in this social justice effort and improve our quality of life, that we are aware that APIs is a huge group of San Diegans.
Yeah, and I think we've heard, or at least I've heard it, lately, is, AAPIs are not a monolith. Everyone has different experiences. So you bring up a good point, and you also bring up a good point who is not being heard as much lately. So it is important to remember as we continue to have these discussions. Leonard, I want to bring you back. This is your last formal question, unless we get any more. If you can explain, what is the role of the DA's office in responding to these hate crimes? I think a lot of people might not understand the process, because if I have an issue, the first thing, I don't call you, right? How does all that work?
Yeah, so if you're the victim of a hate crime, obviously we encourage victims of hate crime to report to law enforcement. And I know that can be difficult, but it is one of those things where unless it is reported, there are a whole bunch of services that are not available to victims, like Joanne mentioned earlier, unless a crime is reported. So our role as far as combating hate crimes, it's really threefold. We obviously prosecute cases that come to us when a hate crime is committed. We try to protect and support our victims of hate crimes. And then we also try to do prevention where we can. So everyone knows, the DA's office, we're prosecutors. So when we get a case, That's where the investigation's been completed by law enforcement. We review it, we decide what charges to file, and if hate crimes are appropriate, we file those hate crimes charges. In San Diego, we were the first DA's office in the state to have a dedicated hate crimes unit that we started some 25, 30 years ago. And I'm fortunate to be the person who's in charge of that now. But it's always been a priority for our DA's office, and in particular for Summer Stephan, the current DA. As far as protecting and supporting victims, we have a team of victim advocates who are assigned to every hate crime case. They offer emotional support, court support when witnesses have to testify. They can assist with payment of medical bills or security measures, and in the appropriate case, they can also assist with relocation. So those are some of the services that we can offer when it comes to protecting and supporting victims of crime. The final piece is something that a lot of people don't think that we do a lot of, and that's prevention. I kind of see every case that comes across my desk as an opportunity to prevent that person from committing crimes in the future. And a lot of people think the only way we can prevent them from doing crimes in the future is to lock them up. And that's simply not true. I think some of the restorative justice programs and getting the offender to see from the victim's point of view how that crime impacted them can sometimes be the biggest deterrent for them to commit crimes again in the future. Just hearing from the victim how that crime impacted them. And so wherever I can, those kinds of things are things that we think about. They tend to be more successful, to be honest, with youthful offenders, people who haven't had biased beliefs for years or decades. And so I'm more likely to offer those types of services to people who are younger. But the other component to prevention is that we advocate for the sharing of information between federal and state law enforcement officials. We had a case right after the Chabad Poway shooting where an individual praised the shooter to his coworkers. His coworkers knew that he had easy access to firearms, and they also knew that his employer was about to let him go. And so in their minds, that was sort of a red flag potential triggering event. And so they actually notified authorities, and authorities were able to get a gun violence restraining order, which allowed them to seize all the firearms. And during the course of that seizure, they learned that he was kind of one of those white nationalist incels that are very concerning to anyone who works in the field of hate crimes or domestic terrorism, and very likely prevented a mass tragedy right after the Chabad Poway shooting. So those are the kinds of things that the DA's office does, prosecuting cases, protecting victims, and then prevention when we can.
Thanks, Leonard. And then we do have a few more questions. And Leonard, since you're the one with the most legal experience here, I'm not 100% sure you can answer this question, but this was a question that came in. And we do have to clarify that obviously Leonard has no involvement or inside knowledge with this case, but someone had asked me, with the recent shooting in Atlanta, it seemed that the media rushed to categorize it as a hate crime. With the definition of a hate crime being covered earlier, it seems that there's no evidence that the shooter was motivated by anti-Asian hate. My question is there any evidence that suggests Robert Long was driven by anti-Asian hate rather than another motive? Obviously, you don't have insight, but you can talk about what they're looking at to try to determine that.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the kind of most recent, mass shooters like Robert Bowers, Bretton Tarrant, Dylan Roof, they all made very clear what their intent was and who their targets were and why. And so that is something, at least as far as what law enforcement shared in the Atlanta shooting, something that we don't know about yet. We don't know if there are writings or past indications that there is a potential bias against the Asian community. And so it's hard to say right now. I mean, Atlanta police has shared some details regarding his statement, but defendants don't always tell the truth when they talk about their motivations for why they commit crimes. And so it's really hard to say at this point. I suspect that once court proceedings move along, more of those details will be released, and then we might be able to know more.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. Joanne, I want to bring you back real quick. We talked about resources. If you can quickly just go over some of the resources available to the community, what resources should be available for the community. And then again, I know we had some people posted in chat. The chat got kind of long. So if you want to go ahead and post your links to your organizations or other resources, you can go ahead and do that again. So yeah, Joanne, if you can answer that question.
Or the API Coalition is a good source for information. We're trying to work with 211 to better list organizations. Luckily, we do have an ally that had worked with the County Board of Supervisor that's there at 211. That is also another initiative working with Mayor Todd Gloria and also with the County of San Diego is a directory of resources that's readily available. There's information on websites like the county and the city, but it's hard to find. Sometimes it's really deep into the website. So those types of things is what we're trying to work on, because the city and county of San Diego, the County of San Diego has a plethora of information and resources, but we just need to make it user friendly. And also, again, to try to give that concierge service, to have a face to the name of the department or the program is what we need. And so I'll list that. I was hoping we can bring Joe Garbanzos. He's a friend of our community. He's also a faculty lecturer at Alliant International University. We just came off of another panel with some of you with Congressman Scott Peters. So if there's a possibility either that he posts in the chat, or is he able to go live with us, Melissa?
You know, I think if he can post in the chat, that might be just a more succinct way to do it. But if he wants to just put information in the chat to make that available, that might just be an easier way to go ahead and get that information out there.
Because he's also president of the AARP California. And AARP is another great source, especially for our seniors or older adults that may need assistance. So I'll post a few links with you, but that is an ongoing, it's an ongoing directory, I believe, that needs to be updated, because there are a number of new organizations providing services, and also to help navigate some of these websites that have great resources, like we have now with San Diego Housing Commission and the City of San Diego to provide rental and utility assistance. Many people in our communities may not know that's available, $82 million, but we have to put it out there. So I'm sharing it verbally, but we do need to improve that communication and outreach in the API community.
Joanne, thank you so much. Farhad, what can the everyday regular Joe Schmo, San Diegans do to combat anti-AAPI hate crimes? And then a second part to this question, that if you know the answer, someone had mentioned, we talked about it earlier, the lack of historical facts in our history books in our educational system is shameful. That's according to someone who is listening in. Where can people go in San Diego to learn about some of this stuff that maybe they didn't get that education in a book?
Yeah, both good questions. So the first part, I would say, one, I think it's incumbent upon each and every one of us to recognize and call out discrimination when we see it. And that can be as simple as, when your friend says something inappropriate or says, oh, well, it was just a joke, you can say, actually, that joke is inappropriate, and let me tell you why. I think we get to this place when we don't stand up and we don't say something, and people sort of assume that because they're not getting any pushback, that what they said is okay. And it takes all of us to stand up to that and say, no, it's not okay, and do that education within our own communities, our own networks. And two, I think it's again incumbent upon each and every one of us to model inclusivity and compassion and uphold human rights and human dignity. And remember that words matter, and our actions matter. it's our own personal examples that can inspire others. We can remind our fellow citizens and ourselves that each and every person is created equal and has innate human dignity that must be respected and protected equally. You don't have to solve the problem by yourself. You know, none of us are going to be able to solve this problem individually, but if we all work together, it will make a difference. Demonstrating compassion for people who are different from you. I think all of that is incredibly important. In terms of the education piece, I mean, that is the most important question here. And I think part of it is doing research within our own families, our own homes, and our own communities, and making sure that that is a part of how we talk to our kids, how we talk to our loved ones, and being intentional about filling some of those gaps in our educational system. Because I think, again, there's sort of a two-pronged approach here. One, we need to fix that within our educational system. And two, until we get there, because we know that that takes time, I think it is an important responsibility at the family level, at the community level, to fill some of those gaps. And I know that there are lots of fantastic lists online that folks can find on every single piece of the Asian American and Pacific Islander contribution to the United States and the history of this country. There are a lot of fantastic resources out there.
Farhad, thank you. And you bring up a good point, to talk to your own family about it. And obviously I've spent years as a journalist, but it was more recently that I talked to my own family about some of the racism that we didn't talk about it as much growing up. I don't know if they just didn't want to talk about it, but it was only recently that I heard from my parents about the racism that they experienced. My mom was a longtime ICU nurse, and she told me about the time where a patient said, "I don't want you to treat me. I want a white nurse." And I think I don't know if she just internalized it, but as an adult now, I want my kids, of course, to be more educated, to be aware, and not to have them experience that. So again, turn to your own family. I mean, it's a good starting point to learn about your own history. We have a couple of questions left, and I'm so happy that we're actually on time. Frank, as a community leader, we touched on this a little bit earlier. What are some actionable steps to address issues of inequity effectively?
Sure, thank you, Melissa. So before I answer this quick question, I would like to share you with a quick fact regarding the hate crime. I'm not sure if every one of you know that the Orlando Pulse Club shooter is not classified as a hate crime. So back to the question, how can we address these issues effectively? I talked with a sociology scholar before, and she told me that not to try to find a quick solution for any social problems. Otherwise, we might end up creating more. So hence, there is no silver bullet to address any social problem immediately and quickly, including this one we discussed today. So I urge my fellow Americans to stay calm and level-headed while providing as much support as you can to all these victims. And when we urge the justice system to fully and sufficiently punish all these assailants based on the rule of law, and please only penalize them with their facts of their criminal activities instead of their race or skin color. I strongly believe that people should not be judged by their race, ethnicity, or skin color, and all people should be treated equally. And we as Americans should still love our neighbor and help those in need. And San Diego Asian Americans for Equality has been helping homeless people for 3 years without regard to their race or skin color, and we will continue doing so. And I personally had the past experience that people in this country treat me fairly. And I still have the hope and the faith that the majority of Americans believe in the virtue of equal treatment. And last but not the least, we also need to improve the quality of education for all people so that kids don't fall prey to criminal elements such as street gangs. Last, San Diego Asian Americans will also host a Zoom meeting 2 days later featuring District Attorney Summer Stephan and the Police Chief David Nislett to ensure how the police enforcement will be able to help the community. And thank you, and look forward to you you're joining us on the event 2 days later as well.
Frank, thank you. And to wrap up our program here, if I can bring in Andy Vaughn. Andy, you talked a little bit about it earlier, about the Alliance University's commitment to advancing diversity, equity, inclusion. In your opinion, do institutions of higher learning need to make a verbal commitment, need to make a concrete commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion?
Yes, and I think Joanne mentioned this earlier too, and I couldn't agree more that resolutions and statements and words, they're all great starts. And I think what's most frustrating is when we rely on the words to say, all right, well, we took care of that one. We've issued a resolution that we're totally against this. And then we move on to our daily business. What happens over time is the phrase flavor of the month's been mentioned many times tonight by our panel. And then when the next month happens and a year later, we tend to forget. And so it's really up to us to do much more than that as institutions, is to not just issue a faculty senate resolution or an executive team resolution, or even other organizations do the same in cities and states. That's great. I mean, I certainly welcome those. It provides a memorialization of an incident that needs to change, and it helps, start the conversation, but it is execution that matters. It is actually doing something and measuring those results. It's being held accountable for those things. And so we really encourage institutions. So no one is more famous than universities and colleges for having a strategic plan that's about 300 pages long that nobody reads after the first iteration. And then you look at it, you go, well, I think we met those goals, but I can't quite tell because the way it was written is so vague. It uses flowery words like, be better than, or it's really writing very specific action items on how an institution is actually going to take action to help these inequities. And you can start small, that's okay. I think so many times institutions are guilty of trying to solve the world's problems, and then it's such a big thing to tackle. Build those blocks one at a time and come up with very specific actions that you are going to do as a university in your own communities that you serve. And how are you going to measure success, whether that's a month, a quarter, or a year? Be very, very specific. Let's take action and not just use words. I think that's the most important part.
And I want to thank, first of all, Dr. Mohammed Ahmed, for helping with this panel. Andy Vaughn, of course, the president and CEO of Alliant. Camille Chow, who had to leave a little early with Boston Scientific and a former ESPN anchor. Joanne Fields, a director for Filipino Resource Center. Frank Xu, a board member with the Asian Americans for Equality. Leonard Trin with the San Diego D's office, the lead hate crime prosecutor. And Ms. Farhad Paul, thank you so much, the Immigrant Affairs Manager. And of course, Christopher Tenorio with the Southern District U.S. Attorney's Office. I really appreciate your time and your openness. I think this is a first step, hopefully not the last step. We put some links in the chat for those listening that want to take that down. My contact information is there as well for anyone that wants to send me a story that maybe has not been covered and should be covered. So again, thank you. Hopefully you guys can eat dinner if you haven't, and everyone please have a great night.